How do athletes get away with doping? Lance Armstrong won the Tour de France 7 times. Throughout his career, he was repeatedly drug tested, and for years, he used the fact that he hadn't produced a definitive positive test as part of his defense. But now we all know he was doping.
I've said it for 7 years. I've said it for longer than 7 years. I have never doped. If you consider my situation, a guy who comes back from arguably a death sentence, why would I then enter into a sport and dope myself up and risk my life again? That's crazy.
EPO, testosterone, and perhaps most interestingly, blood transfusions. So that raises a pretty uncomfortable question. If one of the biggest athletes in the world could be tested again and again without being caught at the time, how much does a negative drug test actually tell us? And are the testers catching the cheaters, or are the cheaters always one step ahead? I think this is the first thing people misunderstand about doping. An athlete passing a drug test does not necessarily mean that this athlete has never used performance-enhancing drugs. It means that the anti-doping system didn't establish a violation from that test. There are two very different things, because you've got to remember what anti-doping authorities are dealing with. There are anabolic steroids, EPO, growth hormone, blood manipulation, stimulants, diuretics, and masking agents, and potentially new substances that testing laboratories have not even encountered before. Testing technology is constantly evolving, but so is doping, and Lance Armstrong gives us probably the most famous example of that arms race.
No. Did you ever take banned substances to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Yes or no? Was one of those banned substances EPO?
Yes.
Did you ever blood dope or use blood transfusions to enhance your cycling performance?
Yes.
Did you ever use any other banned substances like testosterone, cortisone, or human growth hormone?
Yes.
Yes or no? In all 7 of your Tour de France victories, did you ever take banned substances or blood dope?
Yes.
In your opinion, was it humanly possible to win the Tour de France without doping 7 times in a row?
Not in my opinion.
Armstrong's story is incredible because this wasn't simply someone taking a tablet and nobody noticed. USADA's investigation eventually described an organized doping program involving EPO, testosterone, cortisone, and blood transfusions. And blood transfusions are particularly interesting. The basic idea behind blood doping is increasing the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. More red blood cells can mean more oxygen delivered to working muscles. Now, for an endurance athlete, you can understand why that could provide an enormous advantage.
What EPO does again is it increases red blood cell count, and as we all know or may not know, the more red blood cells that you have, the more oxygen that gets delivered to your working muscles. So more oxygen equals being able to run, ride faster, longer.
Here's where anti-doping historically had a massive problem. For part of Armstrong's career, USADA reported that there wasn't an available testing method capable of detecting most of these methods being used. So imagine the problem facing the testers. How do you test for something when the test doesn't exist yet? That's why Armstrong's story completely destroys the argument. He's been tested loads of times, therefore he must be clean. History has shown us that those two things are not necessarily the same. There's another issue. A banned substance doesn't necessarily remain detectable forever. The performance benefit and the period during which a laboratory can identify evidence of use aren't necessarily the same thing. And historically, sophisticated doping programs understood that. Look, I'm not going to turn this video into a tutorial on timings, dosages, or how athletes should try to manipulate individual tests. But the important principle is this. Testing is a snapshot. Imagine you're trying to photograph lightning. If you're looking in the right place at the right time, you catch it. But if you're looking several hours or several days later, the sky might look completely normal. This is one of the reasons modern anti-doping doesn't simply test athletes immediately after they win something. Out of competition testing became hugely important.
454 samples from the 2008 Beijing Games, which were retested.
Because if athletes knew when every test was coming, the system would be far easier to manipulate. And then we have an even bigger problem. What happens when a new performance-enhancing substance appears before laboratories have developed a reliable way of testing it? Anti-doping is constantly playing catch-up. A substance emerges, scientists learn about it, a detection method is developed, athletes and the people helping them potentially look for something else, which creates an arms race. And this isn't unique to sport. It's the same basic problem we see with cybersecurity, every time somebody develops better security, someone else starts looking for a new vulnerability. The difference is that in elite sport, fractions of a second can be worth millions of pounds, or an Olympic gold medal. That's an enormous incentive. This is where things get much more interesting, because modern anti-doping isn't simply give us some urine and we'll see if there's a steroid in it. One of the biggest developments has been the athlete biological passport. Instead of only asking, can we find the drug? Authorities can also monitor biological markers over a period of time. Think of it like creating an individual biological fingerprint for an athlete. If their blood normally behaves within a certain pattern and suddenly something looks abnormal, that can raise suspicions and potentially trigger a further investigation. So now the athlete isn't necessarily just competing against a drugs test, they're competing against their own historical biology. And interestingly, even Lance Armstrong later acknowledged that the biological passport changed things. There's another weapon available to anti-doping authorities: time. Samples can potentially be stored and analyzed again later using improved technology. And psychologically, I think that's huge. Because imagine cheating at an Olympic Games, you pass your test, you get your medal, you go home, 2 years later testing improves, your sample still exists. Suddenly that negative test from years ago isn't necessarily the end of the story. The testers don't always have to beat the cheaters today. Sometimes they can just catch them tomorrow. And this is where we need to be very careful. None of this means that every elite athlete is doping, and I definitely don't think it's fair to point at someone performing exceptionally and say they must be on drugs. Extraordinary genetics exist, extraordinary athletes exist.
14.75 they're looking for, and Bolt is looking very, very strong. He's already away from the rest of this field. He's destroying them. This is a magnificent piece of running. Look at the 9.9 through 100 meters. Astonishing. 14.
And performances we once thought were impossible eventually became possible. But I also don't think we should make the opposite mistake. We shouldn't assume they've never failed a drugs test, therefore we know they're clean. Because sport in history simply doesn't support that conclusion. Marion Jones never failed a conventional drugs test throughout her whole career. 4-time Olympic champion, I believe she was. Lance Armstrong spent years denying doping while pointing towards his testing record. We've seen medals removed years after competition. So when you watch an unbelievable performance, you don't necessarily need to be cynical, but perhaps you shouldn't be completely naive either. And that's what fascinates me most about doping in sport. It's an arms race. On one side, you've got WADA, anti-doping organizations, laboratories, and scientists developing increasing sophisticated ways of detecting cheating. On the other, you potentially have athletes, coaches, doctors, and chemists with enormous financial and sporting incentives to stay ahead of them. It's a bit like a cat and mouse game. Sometimes the testers win, sometimes they win years later, and sometimes we may never know. So perhaps the question isn't how many athletes are doping, because none of us can honestly answer that. Maybe the more interesting question is, at any given moment, who is technologically ahead, the cheaters or the testers? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't watched my previous video on doping and the Olympics, watch that next, because some of the stories behind Olympic medals are absolutely insane. Please like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate your support as always.